Hiking, traveling into a mysterious forest, up a dangerous mountain. What happens if you're alone and it's nighttime? What you tend to find is some pretty strange things, some pretty bizarre encounters in the landscapes of Mother Nature. So grab a blanket, turn off your lights, 'cause here's 7 stories of weird, scary hiking stories that have nothing to do with the paranormal. Deer Head. Too late to the party. I'm a ranger at Yellowstone. Couple weeks ago, I was exploring the Lamar Valley, about 11 miles from the nearest road, and even further to the park boundaries. There, in the middle of the trail, is a perfectly severed deer head. No blood, no raggedness at the severance, perfectly intact. This is weird because I've seen wolves and bears kill, and I used to find cougar kills in SD with radio tracking just after the cougar made them. This was not any one of those. The head was completely uneaten, eyes, tongue, perfectly everything intact. Even the ravens hadn't touched it yet, right smack in the trail. But again, no blood. Even a human doing it made no conventional sense. It was a doe, so it had no antlers, plus why leave it in the trail? Whole thing, even in broad daylight, gave me the chills. Just an ocean of waving grass, bison calmly grazing, and a perfectly clean deer head right on the path. Heads. I was in a tiny town in South America, in the middle of nowhere. I decided to take a long walk along the river, leaving my travel companions in the town. About 20 minutes in, I wandered past a big rock sticking up from the ground that made a sort of small cave. In this cave was a human skull. I turned around, and on the other side of the river, on a narrow river, a farmer was yelling at me and waving a hoe. I ran away. Edit. It didn't help that I breathlessly told the local family I had gone with that I'd seen heads, which paints a slightly different picture on my discovery. They eventually realized that I just didn't know how to say skulls in Spanish. Whoops. Missing person. My son is in Cub Scouts, and every year, we take a trip to a cabin with the rest of his den. One kid's uncle is a park ranger. So last year, we went to the park he worked at, as it was near the cabin. He'd been a ranger for a good while and had some great stories. The story of his first week on the job was the worst. First week on the job, the new guy, in a fairly large park. It's colder out, so not as busy as summer. The park is notified of a possibly missing camper. Family can't contact the guy, and he would camp there quite often. Of course, they send the new guy to go find him. Car is located by the campgrounds, but dude is still nowhere to be found. The ranger goes deeper and deeper into the forest and comes across a campsite. There's a smell, and the ranger knew what was up, but had to check to make sure. Dude set up the camp got in his sleeping bag and blew his head off with a shotgun. Ranger said, the worst part was after radioing it. Remember, just his first week on the job, he had to stay at the campsite until other rangers and law enforcement and local medical examiners made their way up there. He said it's a very common occurrence. People often think they're sparing their loved ones the horror of discovering them, so instead they go out in the middle of fucking nowhere and do it. Never mind the poor park ranger that's gonna find you. Rude. When I was a young Boy Scout, my troop was hiking through some narrow canyons on the way to a campsite. It was nighttime and near pitch dark since no starlight or moon could reach us, so most of us had flashlights out. We start turning around this bend, and directly ahead, sitting on this boulder, was a man. He had no gear, no backpack, just sitting alone in the middle of a pitch black canyon. We stop dead in our tracks looking at him, and he says, "It's rude to shine light on people's faces," in the most disturbing voice. We apologize and continue to our campsite. We named him Psycho Greg. The cabin. For a friend from college, she was a middle schooler, so when she went on some hiking trip through the woods with a club she was a part of, it had started to get dark, so the older group members decided to lead everybody back. However, it quickly became quite apparent that they didn't know what they were doing and where they were. It was getting darker and darker, and they were still not able to figure out where they were. Eventually, they stumbled across a small cabin. Without many other options, the group leaders decided to ask whoever was in there if the group can stay the night. They approached the door and knocked, but there was no answer. They knocked a couple more times, and still, no response. They tried the handle and found that the cabin was unlocked. As they entered, they were pretty freaked out by what they saw. Along the walls were several pairs of shoes. Scattered along another wall were a few bed frames. But the most startling thing was that the walls were covered in chicken scratch writing. Everybody was freaked out, but it was too dark at this point to risk wandering into the woods blindly again. The group hunkered down on the floor. They didn't get much sleep that night, but when daylight broke, they got the hell out of there. Like I said, this is all according to a friend from school, so it could be a load of shit or an overactive childhood imagination. But it's always stuck with me ever since she told me the story. The Abandoned. Long-time lurker. First-time poster. We have a family cabin in the middle of nowhere, on a small lake with 2 other cabins, surrounded by forested area and flatlands both. About 2 miles away from the cabin, and across the dirt road, is a wildlife reserve. As kids, we walked through there all the time. had the opposite of helicopter parents. After about 30 minutes walking straight into these woods, there used to be a collection of abandoned houses and old settlement. We went exploring and found that the people who used to live there had just up and left. In each house, there were still dishes on the tables, clothing in the closets, cars parked in the clearings, and all the strappings for horses in the barns. In one house, the floor was caved in, and there was about 40 pairs of women's shoes scattered around the hole in the middle. No bones though, animal nor human. Nothing. We decided to stay away from the second floors of the houses. After we saw that, we figured that they may be structurally unsound. A skeletal treehouse in the middle of a clearing. After we told my parents, my dad wanted to come and look too. In one of the houses, we found a bedroom, fully intact. The sheets were still on the bed. The pillows still had the indentations of a head on it. But everything else was covered in a thick layer of dirt, and the dust on the floors only had our footprints in it. At the foot of the bed was this stunning, enormous gray fur coat. There were a few moth holes chewed in it, and it was as dirty as everything else, but when we inspected it, we knew it was real fur, likely wolf or silver fox. It was gorgeous. My dad decided he was going to bring it back and clean it up to see if he could have it remade for my mom. As we were leaving, I got a chill on the back of my neck. And about 60 yards from the house, I turned around and saw an old lady glaring at us from the window of the second floor. She had her hair in a loose bun and was wearing a blue shawl on her shoulders over a cream-colored blouse. I immediately felt super guilty. I grabbed my dad, who was about 10 yards ahead of me, and told him we had to better put the coat back because the woman was still living there, and we probably scared her and she looked quite pissed. We turned back around, and I pointed to the window I saw her glaring at us from. No one there. I said she must have gone downstairs, and as we approached the house, still carrying the stupid coat, one of the windows in another house suddenly slammed shut. I fucking ran as fast as I could into the woods. Dad, being Dad, stayed behind and started yelling for the lady to come out. He went upstairs. No one was there. Dust on the floor still undisturbed. Then he felt something. In an instant, he smarted up and dropped the coat in a big hurry and beat it back to the road as fast as we could. About 5 years later, the government demolished the whole thing. The date. It was a while ago, but someone had a story on here where they were on a first date and they ended up unknowingly walking into a Ted Bundy murder. He was there watching them, but they didn't know it until he did an interview, and he said 2 people almost caught him one night. Here it is. It was near Halloween time when my friends and I were telling ghost stories. My friend said she was going to tell a story about her parents' first date. She said she didn't like telling the story since it was actually true, but we prodded her on. To cut to the chase, the parents had spent a nice, if awkward, first date, and around the time that they would have to say goodnight, the male in the situation, my friend's dad, suggested that they go for a midnight hike up Provo Canyon. He apparently knew the place since he had done a fair amount of rock climbing in the area. So the two drove up to the mouth of the canyon, got out of their cars, and started hiking under just the light of the stars, since it was a new moon. At some point, the male starts getting a bad feeling. Since the pathway ahead, which would pass under some trees, would be quite dark, and because it was getting to be quite late, he ignores the feeling and presses on. In later rehearsings of the story, the female would often say that she had felt the same feeling at what was probably the same time, though she didn't know the trail like he did. A minute later, the feeling came back to the male. He ignored it again and started walking a bit of the way into the trees when his foot hit something soft in the middle of the path. Under the trees, it was too dark to see just what this soft thing was, and the feeling came back stronger than ever. Instead of finding out what his foot had bumped into, he and the female both agreed to hightail it out of there. Years later, after being married for some time, they were watching an interview with the serial killer, Ted Bundy. In response to a question asking him to describe the time that he felt closest to being caught, he explained about the night that he lured a girl into Provo Canyon and had just killed her when he heard some people coming up the trail. He explained how he hid in the trees just in time, only to watch some guy walk right into the body and for some reason just turn around and walked away.